Okay, this is your lecture over neurodevelopmental disorders, what we actually used to call disorders of the childhood. And what I want to focus on during this lecture is why we actually used to call them that, because you'll see that a part of the criteria for the four main disorders I'm going to talk about today have an age component to them or some sort of developmental period. So I'm really going to focus on four. IDD, which is intellectual developmental disorder, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and conduct disorder. So there are a few other disorders within this chapter, including learning disorders and things like that, but I really want us to focus on these four. So again, criteria are listed here on the board. For IDD, the age component is that the deficit has to occur within a developmental period. It's written in this way because there's many different things that can cause IDD. IDD is what we used to call mental retardation. We don't use the term retardation anymore. It's now considered IDD, or developmental disability, depending upon your particular profession. So essentially, there can be genetic causes. As about a third of the cases it's genetic. There can be environmental toxins that can occur prenatally or postnatally, and those are kind of the different causes that we typically look at. So some point in time in the early developmental period, usually during childhood, we'll see IDD. There is some kind of intellectual deficit, so that usually means a below 70 on an IQ test, and you have to confirm that that is accurate with a clinical interview. Sometimes people don't do well on an intellectual test because they don't have any motivation. In addition to that, there has to be some kind of adaptive functioning issues. So conceptually is academic stuff, math, reading, etc. Social is social communication, and practical are practical skills like knowing that you should shower every day, things like that. So that's IDD. You have to have all three of these criteria. This is different from autism. With autism, we typically see these symptoms before the age of 3, so that's our age criteria. But what we usually look for are social communication deficits, and you can see that there is actually similarities here between IDD and autism, but social communication deficits are a much more prominent part of autism spectrum disorder. We also see that there is some sort of repetitive or restrictive behaviors. So they have to do things in the same order every time, or they become really hyper-focused on a particular topic. So that's kind of how we separate autism and IDD. About 60% or so of individuals with autism also have IDD, but they are not necessarily one and the same, and just because you have autism does not mean you have some sort of intellectual deficit. That's a really important thing that I hope that you guys get from this chapter and the material that you're doing with this chapter. ADHD, and it's always ADHD, there's no such thing as ADD, I'll explain that in a second. There is an age component. You have to have these symptoms or show these symptoms before the age of 12. Now that doesn't mean that adults can't have these symptoms, but for this particular criteria right now, you must show these symptoms and meet this criteria before the age of 12 first. If you didn't experience this as a child, you can't be diagnosed with it as an adult, at least not ADHD. There's another disorder for that. You have to show these in multiple symptoms. You have to have some kind of impairment. Again, we see social impairment as being a connection here. And then there's two different ways that we can go about this. There's a whole series of what we call inattentive symptoms. So symptoms where you're not focusing. It's that whole like, squirrel thing. You have to have 6 of them to meet that criteria for inattentive symptoms. Then there's a section that's hyperactive or impulsive symptoms. So always moving around, fidgeting, things like that. You have to have 6 of those to meet this criteria. If you only have inattentive symptoms, then you have ADHD inattentive type. That's what some doctors call ADD. But ADD doesn't actually exist in the DSM. It's ADHD inattentive type. If you only meet the criteria for the hyperactive impulsive, then it's ADHD hyperactive impulsive type. If you meet the criteria for both, so at least 6 symptoms up here, 6 symptoms down here, then you have combined type, both of them. So there's 3 different types of ADHD, but there is no kind of ADD. All right, the last one is conduct disorder. It's the one that's actually most different from the other ones. There is an age component. You have to have conduct disorder before the age of 18. After the age of 18, we can no longer diagnose conduct disorder. Time's up very quickly. It's a pattern of violating others' rights. So conduct disorder is really about being mean or cruel to other people. It's not really about their own behaviors necessarily. And so what that means is that within a year they have to show 3 or more severe symptoms. So we're talking about aggression, like fighting with individuals or killing animals, things like that. Theft of some kind, property destruction, fire setting, etc., and severe rule violation. This isn't being 5 minutes late for curfew, this is staying out all night and not coming home until the morning and you're still an adolescent. So conduct disorder is really different from the other 3 in that it's about violating other people's rights, whereas with IDD, autism, and ADHD, we're really looking at how they're functioning and what kinds of impairments they're experiencing in terms of how we separate these 3 from each other. But again, as you can see, age is usually younger for all of them, and so that's why we used to call these disorders disorders of the child, or childhood disorders.